He didn't want a companion. He wanted a fire tender, a pair of hands to scrub the blood from his hunting skins. Elias traded 5 gold eagles for a Swedish girl who couldn't speak a lick of English. He expected a servant. What stepped off the train ruined him. Elias lived where the air was thin enough to make a lowland man spit blood. His cabin, a squat structure of notched pine and mud chinking, sat tight against the granite ribs of the Bitterroot Range. Inside, it smelled of cured meat, wet hound, and decades of stale wood smoke, though Elias would have simply called it peace. Winter was coming. The dull ache in his right knee, a lingering souvenir from a steel trap 3 seasons prior, told him so. He was 34, his beard matted with pine pitch, his hands scarred and heavily calloused like old saddle leather. The last time he'd tried to sew up a tear in his wool trousers, he'd bled on the fabric. The time before that, he'd nearly burned the cabin down trying to render bear fat on a roaring stove. He was surviving, but the margins between living and freezing to death were getting desperately thin. So he wrote a letter. He sent it down the mountain with a passing prospector, addressed to a matron in St. Louis who made a living trading in misplaced women. Send one strong enough to chop wood. Don't care if she's pretty, just need her sturdy. 3 months later, Elias stood on the muddy, frost-heaved planks of the train depot in Helena. The town reeked. It was an assault on his senses: coal, sulfur, cheap rye whiskey, horse manure, and the sour scent of unwashed bodies pressing too close. Elias hated it. He shifted his weight, his heavy canvas coat pulling at his shoulders, his Sharps rifle resting casually but deliberately in the crook of his arm. He watched the steam engine hiss to a grinding, screeching stop. Women filed out onto the platform. They were frightened, pale things wrapped in dusty broadcloth, clutching small bags, their eyes wide with the terror of the frontier. Then, he saw her. She didn't look around with the panicked, deer in the headlights, stare the others possessed. She stood rigid on the platform, a battered leather valise gripped in 2 white-knuckled hands. Her coat was boiled wool, dyed a cheap indigo that had bled into the stiff collar of her white blouse. Her hair, a pale, dusty blonde, was pulled back so tight against her scalp it looked painful. Her jaw was set. He approached her, his boots heavy on the wood. She flinched, just a microscopic tightening of her shoulders, but she held her ground. She didn't shrink back. "You Linnea?" he asked. His voice was a harsh rasp. He hadn't spoken to a human being in 6 weeks. She stared at his mouth, watching the movement of his lips through his beard. Then, her pale blue eyes flicked up to his. They were the color of glacial ice, and just as cold. She gave a single jerky nod. "Linnea." "Yes." Her accent was incredibly thick, the vowels sharp, hard, and foreign. "Elias." He pointed a dirt-stained thumb at his chest. "Elias," she repeated carefully, as if testing the weight of the word on her tongue. He didn't offer to take her bag. He just turned and started walking toward where he'd hitched the wagon. After a second, he heard the heavy scrape of her boots against the frozen mud, falling into step behind him. The justice of the peace was a sweating man who smelled heavily of raw onions and gin. The ceremony took exactly 4 minutes. Elias paid the fee, signed the ledger with a heavy hand, and handed Linnea the pen. She gripped it like a weapon, the nib scratching harshly against the parchment as she wrote out her name. Linnea Olofsson. No, Linnea Boone now. The wagon ride up the mountain took 2 grueling days. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The wooden wheels hammered mercilessly against exposed granite and rutted dirt, shaking their bones. Elias drove the mules, his eyes fixed on the tree line. Linnea sat on the hard wooden bench beside him, clutching her valise on her lap. The temperature dropped 10 degrees with every 1,000 feet of elevation. The air turned brittle, biting at their exposed skin. On the first night, they camped under a jagged shelf of rock. Elias built a fire, threw a tin of salted beans directly onto the coals, and handed her a fork. She ate methodically, scraping the tin clean, not leaving a single bean behind. When a coyote howled a high, lonely shriek tearing through the dark, she stopped chewing. Her eyes darted to the black, impenetrable tree line. Elias watched the firelight dance across her face. "Ain't gonna bother us," he grunted. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the low, even timbre of his voice. She went back to eating. She wasn't delicate. He noted the rough, yellowed calluses on her fingers when she handed the empty tin back to him. Good. She'd need them up here. When they finally crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view, the first snow had begun to fall. It dusted the split-shake roof like fine ash. The wind howled through the notch, a physical force that bit straight through Elias's sheepskin coat. He pulled back on the reins, halting the mules. "Home," he said. Linnea looked at the squat, ugly structure. It was completely isolated, perched on the edge of a jagged drop-off, flanked by towering pines that blocked out the late afternoon sun. She didn't cry. She didn't smile or feign relief. She just tightened her jaw, climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the fresh snow, and waited for him to push open the heavy door. Inside, the cabin was bitter. The hearth was completely cold, thick with a mountain of gray ash. Elias watched her step over the threshold. He half expected her to collapse into one of the hand-hewn chairs, maybe weep at the squalor. There was a stack of unwashed, grease-caked iron skillets on the table. A pile of bloody rabbit pelts sat curing in the corner, smelling of copper and raw meat. The air was stagnant and heavy. Linnea set her valise down on the floorboards. She didn't bother taking off her coat. Instead, she walked straight past him to the hearth, knelt in the dirt, and stared at the ash. Then she turned back to him, holding out her open hand. Elias frowned, his brow furrowing. "What?" She pointed to the cold fireplace, then mimed, striking a match against stone. She held her hand out again, her gaze unwavering. He reached into his pocket and tossed her his tin of matches. She caught it awkwardly, fumbling before securing her grip. Within 5 minutes, she had a fire roaring, using the dry kindling he'd left in the woven basket. She didn't ask for help. She just worked. The first month was a masterclass in silent friction. Elias had lived entirely alone for 8 years. He had his strict routines, his heavy silences, his highly specific way of placing his boots by the door so the leather wouldn't crack. Linnea disrupted everything simply by breathing the same air. She smelled different. It wasn't perfume she clearly owned. None but a sharp, practical scent of lye soap, damp wool, and something fundamentally earthy that Elias couldn't quite place. She moved his things. He'd reach blindly for his skinning knife where he usually left it on the table, only to find she had scrubbed the blade clean and hung it on a peg by the door. He'd snarl at her, a low sound of pure irritation. She'd stop sweeping, stare back at him unblinking, and return to her work without a word. She was relentless, a machine of flesh and bone. She scrubbed the rough-hewn floors until the raw wood grain showed through decades of grime. She boiled his filthy flannel shirts in a heavy iron pot until the water turned pitch black, then hauled fresh snowmelt to boil them again. She butchered the mule deer he brought home, her forearms slick with hot blood, her face set in a grim, immovable mask of concentration as she separated meat from bone. She didn't complain about the gore, but she also never smiled. There was no romance, no soft glances across the dinner table. At night, they slept in the same bed, separated by a thick, scratchy wool blanket rolled down the middle like a barricade. She slept as close to the log wall as physically possible, curled tightly in on herself. Elias slept on the very edge of the mattress, his broad back to her, listening to her shallow, even breathing in the dark. Sometimes in the dead of night, he'd hear her gasp a sharp, muffled sound of distress smothered violently by her pillow. He'd lie awake, staring at the raw beams of the ceiling, clenching his jaw, pretending he didn't hear it. He didn't know how to comfort her. More importantly, he told himself he didn't want to. That wasn't the transaction. She was here to work. He was here to provide the roof and the meat. That was the end of it. Then came the blizzard of November. It hit fast and brutal, dropping 3 feet of heavy, wet snow overnight. The wind screamed down the stone chimney, blowing bitter black smoke back into the room. Elias, cursing the cold, went out to the lean-to to secure the mules and chop extra firewood. He was out there too long. He couldn't see 3 feet in front of his face. As he swung the axe, a massive pine bough above him, weighed down by a thick layer of ice, snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. It caught him square across the right shoulder. The impact knocked him flat into the snowdrift. The pain was immediate, and blinding, a hot, sickening spike of sheer agony driving straight through his collarbone. He tasted copper in his mouth. He tried to push himself up, but his right arm hung entirely useless, a dead weight at his side. The wind howled, stripping the breath from his lungs as he dragged himself through the waist-deep drifts, his vision tunneling into blackness. He practically fell through the cabin door, kicking it shut with the heel of his boot and collapsing against the wood. Linnea dropped the cast-iron pot she was holding. It clattered violently against the hearthstones, spilling boiling water into the fire with a loud hiss. She saw his arm hanging at the wrong angle, saw the terrifying, ashen pallor of his face. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She crossed the room in 3 long strides. She grabbed him by his good arm, her fingers biting into his bicep, and hauled his massive frame toward the bed. Elias gritted his teeth, a ragged curse slipping past his lips. "God damn it, woman, leave it!" She ignored him completely. She forced him down onto the mattress, then rushed back to the fire. She brought a basin of hot water, a clean rag, and his sharpest hunting knife. She didn't bother trying to unbutton his coat. She took the knife and sliced straight through the thick sheepskin and flannel. The fabric tore with a sickening rip. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving, bracing for the inevitable, excruciating pain of her clumsy hands prodding his broken body. But her hands weren't clumsy. They were remarkably steady. She washed the blood and dirt away, intensely inspecting the ugly bruising that was already blooming purple, yellow, and black across his pale skin. She pressed her thumbs against the joint. Elias hissed, his body violently jerking away from her touch. "Stilla," she commanded. Her voice was low, hard, authoritative. Still, she walked over to the woodpile, found a straight piece of pine kindling, and tore a long length of linen from one of her own petticoats. She returned to the bed. She didn't ask if he was ready. She didn't offer a soothing word. She just grabbed his wrist and his shoulder, her grip iron-strong, and wrenched the joint violently backward to align the dislocation. Elias roared a raw, guttural, animal sound that vibrated in the small confines of the cabin. Operating purely on blinded instinct, he swung his good left fist at her head. She ducked it effortlessly, not even blinking, and pulled the linen tight around the splint. She tied the knot securely, her face just inches from his. He could see a faint sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. He could smell her breath. It smelled of bitter coffee and wood smoke. When she finally finished, she stepped back, wiping her bloody, trembling hands on her coarse apron. She looked down at him, her chest heaving slightly under her blouse. Elias lay there, panting, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving behind a dull, nauseating throb in his shoulder. He stared at her. He really looked at her. She wasn't just a pair of hands hired to scrub pots. She had grit. She had a spine made of the same unforgiving, brutal iron as the mountain outside their door. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and scratching. Obliged, he rasped, the word tasting unfamiliar. Linnea looked at him for a long, heavy moment. A muscle ticked rapidly in her jaw. Then, she picked up the bloody basin, turned her back to him, and walked to the sink. "Du er en door," she muttered into the basin. She didn't know he had learned a few words of Swedish from a drunken trapper years ago. He knew exactly what it meant. "You are a fool." For the first time in 8 years, Elias smiled. It was a small, fractured thing, cracking the icy exterior of his bearded face. He turned his head toward the log wall. The blizzard raged outside, beating against the shutters, but the cabin felt incredibly warm against the storm. The oppressive silence that had existed between them for a month had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer empty and hostile. It was waiting. Elias spent the next 3 weeks confined to the narrow bed, burning with a low-grade fever and suffocating under the weight of his own uselessness. The cabin smelled of sour sweat, drawing poultices of wet pine needles and the cloying, sharp scent of arnica. He hated it. He hated the ceiling beams he memorized. He hated the dull, throbbing ache in his collarbone that flared every time he drew a deep breath. Most of all, he hated watching Linnea do his work. She did not complain. She simply assumed the burden of his survival with the same grim, unyielding efficiency she applied to scrubbing the floorboards. She hauled the water, breaking the morning ice on the creek with the blunt end of his splitting maul. She chopped the wood, her swings awkward at first, glancing off the frozen pine, until she learned to let the weight of the axe head do the labor. Elias would lie there, his teeth grinding together, listening to the rhythmic thwack-crack echoing from the lean-to. Every strike was a blow to his pride. He had bought a servant to sweep his floors. Instead, he was the invalid, eating the meager stews she cooked from the last of their dried venison. By January, the meat ran out. The snowdrifts were chest-high against the western wall. The wind rattled the shutters like a dying man shaking a tin cup. Elias sat by the hearth, his right arm bound tight to his chest in a dirty linen sling, staring at the bottom of an empty flour sack. His stomach hollowed out, a dull cramp that twisted sharper with each passing hour. Linnea stood by the door. She was wrapped in his spare wool coat, the sleeves rolled up past her wrists. She didn't look at the empty flour sack. She looked at the Sharp's rifle resting on its iron pegs above the mantel. "No," Elias rasped. His voice was brittle, scraped raw by disuse. Linnea ignored him. She dragged a chair to the hearth, climbed up, and lifted the heavy rifle. It was a massive piece of machinery, a 50 to 90 buffalo gun that weighed over 10 pounds. It looked comically large in her hands. "Put it down," Elias warned, trying to push himself up from the chair. His vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges of his sight. "It kicks like a spurred mule. It'll break your damn jaw." She stepped down, checking the breech mechanism the way she had watched him do it a dozen times. She didn't flinch at his tone. She met his eyes, her pale blue gaze flat and unreadable. She walked over to his ammunition box, grabbed 3 heavy brass cartridges, and shoved them deep into her coat pocket. "Jag kommer tillbaka," she said quietly. "I will return." Then she opened the heavy oak door and slipped out into the blinding white maelstrom. The silence she left behind was deafening. Elias sat by the dying fire, entirely consumed by a cold, crawling dread. He wasn't afraid of starving. He was afraid of her not coming back. He pictured her freezing and adrift, the heavy rifle buried in the snow. He pictured her simply walking away, taking her chances down the mountain rather than starving with a crippled man who had bought her like livestock. The hours bled together. The fire burned down to glowing red embers. The cabin grew bitterly cold. Just as the weak gray daylight began to fail, the door shuddered open. Linnea stood in the threshold. She was a terrifying sight. The left side of her face was completely smeared with freezing, dark blood. Her breath plumed in the freezing air in ragged, exhausted gasps. She didn't speak. She just turned and dragged a gutted, headless yearling buck over the threshold, leaving a thick, crimson smear across the snow. Elias stared. He couldn't form a word. She dropped the buck's legs, kicked the door shut, and leaned the rifle against the wall. She was trembling violently, her knees knocking together. She stripped off the heavy, blood-soaked coat. And when she reached for the collar of her stiff, frozen blouse to pull it over her head, she didn't bother to turn around. In the dim light of the embers, Elias saw her bare back. He stopped breathing. From her left shoulder blade down to the curve of her waist, her pale skin was marred by a mass of thick, raised scars. They were old, silvered lines of unspeakable violence, whip marks, or perhaps the tearing drag of a heavy iron rake. They were the scars of a woman who had been broken, punished, and worked like a beast of burden long before she ever set foot on a train in St. Louis. She grabbed a clean linen shirt from a peg and pulled it on, shivering as the fabric settled over her skin. She finally turned to look at him, catching the direction of his stare. She didn't cover up. She didn't look ashamed. She walked over to the buck, picked up her skinning knife, and looked Elias dead in the eye. "A master in Skåne," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. Her English was broken, heavy, but unmistakably clear. "He think he own me. He think I break." She pointed the tip of the bloody knife at the floorboards between them. "I not break. I kill him. Then I come here." The transaction died in that exact moment. Elias looked at the blood on her face, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw, and the dead deer on his floor. She wasn't a misplaced woman who needed a home. She was a fugitive who needed a fortress, and she had just proven she was willing to bleed to keep it. Elias swallowed the knot in his throat. He slowly reached out with his good left hand, took the sharpening stone from the table, and slid it toward her. "Blade's getting dull," he murmured. Linnea stared at the stone. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask slipped. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, and she gave a single, tight nod. She picked up the stone, spat on it, and began to work the edge. Spring arrived not with warmth, but with a brutal, sucking mud. By late April, the snow retreated to the shadows of the pines, leaving the mountain a mess of rushing, swollen creeks and slick, gray clay. Elias's shoulder had knitted together. It was stiff, aching fiercely when it rained, but he could swing an axe again. Their dynamic had fundamentally altered. They still spoke very little. There were no grand declarations, but the heavy, hostile silence was gone, replaced by a synchronized rhythm. When he cleaned his rifle, she pushed a mug of black coffee across the table. When she hauled laundry to the boiling pot, he silently took the heavy iron handles. They were two solitary wolves sharing a den, bound by the shared brutality of outlasting the winter. Then, the mountain brought a different kind of rot. Two men rode up the eastern trail on a Tuesday afternoon. Elias saw them through the window, cheap canvas dusters, low-slung gun belts. Drifters chased out of the mining camps, looking for easy pickings. Inside, Elias ordered softly. Linnea didn't argue. She slipped into the cabin, closing the door until it was just a crack. Elias stepped onto the porch, his thumb resting on the hammer of the Colt revolver in his waistband. The riders pulled up. The leader, a man with rotting teeth and a crooked nose, offered a greasy smile. "Afternoon, neighbor," he drawled, smelling of stale whiskey. "Me and my partner are lost. Hoping you might spare some hot coffee and a bite of meat." "Ain't got nothing to spare," Elias said flatly. "Trail back to town is south." The second man, a twitchy kid, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Saw a woman out here a second ago," he sneered. "Mighty selfish to keep a warm fire and a pretty thing all to yourself, old man." Elias felt the cold spike of violence in his veins. He drew the Colt, leveling it at the leader's chest. "South. Now." The leader raised his hands. "All right, no need to get jumpy." But it was a feint. The man kicked the wooden support post of the porch. The explosive crack startled Elias. In that split second, the younger kid pulled his revolver, firing a deafening shot. The bullet shattered the doorframe, showering Elias in wood splinters. Elias fired back, clipping the kid's shoulder and sending him tumbling into the mud. The leader spurred his horse forward, driving the animal straight up the steps. The horse's chest slammed into Elias, knocking him backward through the open doorway. Elias hit the floorboards, the breath exploding from his lungs. His revolver skittered into the dark corner. The leader vaulted off his horse and stepped into the cabin, gun drawn. He looked down at Elias, who was gasping and clutching his shoulder. The man grinned. Should have just shared the meat. He never saw Linnea move. She didn't scream or panic. The men had looked at her like a prize, a fragile immigrant woman. They didn't know about the master in Skåne. Linnea stepped from the shadows by the hearth. She wasn't holding the heavy rifle. She held the iron kettle, fresh off the fire. With a brutal grunt, she swung it. Boiling water and scalding coffee grounds erupted, catching the leader squarely in the face. The man shrieked in agony, dropping his gun as his hands flew to his melting skin. Linnea didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, reversed her grip, and slammed the heavy, soot-blackened base of the kettle directly into the side of his head. There was a wet crunch. The man crumpled to the floor, motionless. Outside, the kid was screaming, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked through the doorway, saw his partner in a pool of blood and coffee, and saw the stone-faced woman gripping a bloody iron kettle. He scrambled onto his horse and spurred it frantically down the mountain. The silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the hiss of boiling water hitting the hot coals. Linnea stood over the body, her chest heaving, her knuckles white. Slowly, the adrenaline crashed. Her knees wobbled, and the heavy kettle clattered to the floorboards. She slumped against the log wall, sliding down into the dirt, her hands buried in her pale hair. She wasn't crying, but her body shook with violent tremors. Elias pushed himself up. His ribs ached, but he was alive. He looked at the unconscious man, then at Linnea. She was imperfect, raw, deeply scarred, and capable of breathtaking brutality. She wasn't a soft wife to keep his house warm. She was a force of nature, just like the mountain. He walked over and sank onto the floor beside her, his shoulder resting gently against hers. He wrapped his large, rough hand over her trembling fingers, holding them tight. "You're all right," Elias muttered, his voice a low, grounded rumble. "We're all right." Linnea let out a long, ragged breath and leaned her head against his shoulder. Elias realized he had sent 5 gold eagles for a servant, but what the Swedish girl had given him was the only thing that mattered. She had given him an equal. Thank you for listening to this untamed frontier story. If Elias and Linnea's fierce, unspoken bond kept you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe for more gritty, grounded historical dramas. We want to hear from you. What did you think of Linnea's ultimate stand against the drifters? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with fellow story lovers and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next wild ride.